There is a stretch of water 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. You could see across it on a clear day, and for the last 4 months, the most powerful military on Earth and one of the most stubborn regimes in the world have been fighting, threatening, and dying over who gets to say a ship may pass through it. In February, that fight became a war. Last month, they signed a piece of paper and called it peace. Here is the thing nobody wants to say out loud. The paper did not answer the question the war was about. Not one word of it. I'm Daniel Hahn, and on the Hahn board we mapped the forces actually moving the world, not the headlines, the machinery underneath them. So let me tell you what actually happened, because the story you were handed is the wrong shape. The story you were handed goes like this. In late February, the United States and Israel struck Iran. The strikes killed Iran's supreme leader. Iran hit back, American bases, Israel, a scattering of Gulf states, and it did the one thing it has always kept in its back pocket. It reached out, and it closed the Strait of Hormuz. Weeks of brinkmanship followed. A ceasefire in April, mediated by Pakistan, nudged along by China. It broke, more or less, several times. Then, on the 17th of June, the American and Iranian presidents signed a 14-point memorandum of understanding. The blockade lifted. The war was declared complete. Roll credits. That's the story. And it's not wrong exactly. It's just incomplete in the one place that matters. Because here is what's actually at stake. Roughly a fifth of all the oil and liquefied natural gas that moves by sea on this planet moves through that one narrow channel. Around 20 million barrels a day, in normal times. There is no pipeline that replaces it. There is no alternate route that absorbs it. When Hormuz slows down, the whole world's energy bill goes up, not metaphorically, on your receipt at the pump. And in the middle of this crisis, American drivers were being told they were weeks away from $5 gasoline. That number is not an accident. That number is Hormuz, translated into a currency Americans feel. So the war was never really about Iran's nuclear program or missiles or even the supreme leader. Those were the stated reasons. The real prize, the thing every party kept circling back to, the thing the ceasefire talks kept snagging on, was control of 21 miles of water. Who governs it? Who decides which ships pass? And, quietly, whether anyone gets to charge a toll. Hold that word, toll. We're coming back to it. Now let me give you the first thing the coverage mostly skipped. When Iran closed that strait, it did not do it with a fleet of warships lined up like a wall. It couldn't. Iran's navy cannot beat the United States Navy in a straight fight, and everyone in Tehran knows it. What Iran did was subtler, and honestly, more clever. It didn't need to sink every tanker. It only needed to make shipping companies afraid. It needed to plant enough mines, fire enough missiles at enough vessels, that the insurance underwriters in London did the closing for them. Think about that mechanism, because it's the key to everything that follows. A strait doesn't close when the water is blocked, it closes when the risk becomes uninsurable. One analyst put it precisely. The center of gravity here is commercial confidence. Iran's entire strategy was to keep merchant traffic down to a trickle by keeping the perception of danger high. That costs Iran very little, and it costs the world enormously. That is what geopoliticians call asymmetry, and it is the single most important fact about the Strait of Hormuz. The weaker party controls the choke point precisely because closing it is cheap and reopening it is expensive. And if that sounds new, it isn't. This is the second time in living memory that the United States has walked into these exact waters believing that superior force would settle the question, and been taught otherwise. Go back to the 1980s. The Iran-Iraq war spilled out onto the water, and both sides began attacking oil tankers in the Gulf. It got a name, the Tanker War. Hundreds of ships were hit over the course of it, and the American answer then rhymes almost perfectly with the American answer now. Washington agreed to reflag Kuwaiti oil tankers under the American flag and escort them through the strait with the U.S. Navy, an operation they called Earnest Will, the largest naval convoy operation since the Second World War. And it worked. In the narrow sense, the ships got through. But it also dragged the United States into a series of running clashes with Iran, culminating in a day in 1988 when the U.S. Navy sank a good chunk of Iran's operational fleet in a matter of hours. Overwhelming, lopsided, total, tactically. And Iran learned exactly the right lesson from losing that fight. It learned never to fight that fight again. It learned to stop building a navy that could be sunk in an afternoon and start building a strategy that couldn't be sunk at all. Mines, fast boats, shore-based missiles, deniability, and above all, the manipulation of fear. What you're watching in 2026 is the mature version of the doctrine Iran wrote in the ashes of 1988. The United States keeps arriving with the tools that won the last war. Iran keeps fighting the next one. Hold that pattern because it is the deepest current in this entire story, and it explains why raw power keeps failing to produce a result. There's a nearer parallel too, and a smaller one, but it's instructive. In 2019, a series of tankers were struck by limpet mines near the mouth of the Gulf. Nobody was formally, provably held to account. Attribution was contested, deniability was maintained, and yet the message landed with perfect clarity in every shipping office and insurance desk in the world. That was the whole point. You don't need to claim the attack. You just need the market to wonder whether the next ship is yours. Iran has been rehearsing the 2026 strategy for decades. We just weren't paying attention. Which brings us to the American response this time, and the second thing worth slowing down on. The United States tried, more than once, to simply muscle the strait open. It ran mine-clearing operations. It declared, then partially lifted, then reimposed a naval blockade on Iranian ports. At one point, Washington launched an operation to escort merchant ships through a lane it controlled, guarded by the U.S. Navy, running south through Omani waters rather than up along the Iranian coast. It even, by its own account, destroyed a handful of small Iranian boats that had threatened commercial traffic, a claim Iran disputed, and I'll flag that the two sides never agreed on what happened out there, which tells you something about how murky this water is, literally and otherwise. And here's the uncomfortable lesson. Even with all that firepower, the strait did not simply reopen. In the middle of the American escort operation, only a couple of merchant ships were known to have actually made the passage, while hundreds sat bottled up in the Persian Gulf, waiting. The biggest container lines kept saying the same thing. Not yet. Too risky. Our ships aren't going. The world's most powerful navy could deter escalation. It could not, on its own, manufacture the one thing that makes a strait usable: confidence. You cannot escort your way to a market that isn't afraid. Sit with that, because it reframes the whole conflict. The war didn't stall because the U.S. lacked strength. It stalled because strength is the wrong tool for this particular lock. And when your strongest tool doesn't fit the lock, you are forced to do the thing great powers hate doing. You negotiate. On the other side's terms. At least partly. And let me put a number on the pressure, because this is where the geopolitics stops being abstract and starts being your grocery budget. During this crisis, energy analysts were warning that the United States was only weeks away from averaging $5 a gallon for gasoline nationally. One senior analyst at a well-known political risk firm said something that stuck with me, that $5 gas was, in his words, basically baked in, because of the amount of oil already lost to the market, and because there is nothing that replaces Hormuz output. Nothing. Read that carefully. He wasn't predicting $5 gas from what might happen. He was describing it as already locked in by what had already happened. The barrels that didn't move are gone. You can't unloose them. And here's the part that surprises people. Why didn't American producers simply pump more to fill the gap? The White House pressed them, repeatedly, and the industry, by multiple accounts, declined to make big commitments, not out of spite, but out of arithmetic. Ramping up serious new output takes time the crisis didn't allow, and no producer wants to sink capital into new production on the bet that prices stay high, only to watch a ceasefire hold and prices collapse the month the new supply comes online. So you get this cruel little knot. The people who could ease the crisis won't, because easing it might destroy the very price that would pay for the easing. That is not villainy. That is markets doing exactly what markets do. And it means the pain has a floor that no amount of political will can quickly lift. When people tell you energy is just economics and geopolitics is just politics, show them Hormuz. They are the same thing wearing two hats, which is exactly what that 14-point memorandum was. Let me tell you what's inside it, and, more importantly, what is not. The memorandum, signed in mid-June, did three honest things. It stopped the shooting, mostly. It lifted the American blockade, and it opened a 60-day window, a clock, during which the two sides would try to negotiate the hard questions. Freedom of navigation through Hormuz, Iran's nuclear program, its missiles, sanctions relief, all the things that actually caused the war were pushed into the negotiation, not settled by it. I should be straight with you here, no official text of that memorandum was ever published. What we know comes from the version Iran released and the version briefed to journalists, and they line up closely enough to trust the shape of it, if not every comma. And notice the company Hormuz keeps inside that document. It's negotiated in the same 60 days as Iran's nuclear program and its ballistic missiles, two of the hardest, most existential questions in the entire relationship. Files that have defeated negotiators for a generation. Iran has already signaled that some of these, the missile program in particular, it considers simply off the table. Meanwhile, Iran's own conditions, stated months ago, were sweeping, firm guarantees against future aggression, recognition of its rights, even reparations. Stack those against what the Gulf states and Washington want, which is broadly the opposite, and you begin to feel the true weight of what's been crammed into 2 months. This isn't a shipping dispute with some diplomacy attached. It's the whole unfinished argument of the modern Middle East, handed a stopwatch. So read what that structure really is. It is not a peace treaty. It is a ceasefire with a deadline attached, and the central dispute deferred. The war didn't end in June. It changed costume. It walked off stage as a war and walked back on as a negotiation, wearing the same face. And that clock is ticking right now as you watch this. Let me stop here and reset, because we've laid the pieces down, and now I want you to see the board the way I see it. Forget the Iran war. That framing is doing you a disservice. What you are actually watching is a fight over a toll booth. A fight over who owns the right to tax the most important 21 miles of water on the planet. Everything else, the nuclear talk, the missiles, the supreme leader, the Lebanon flare-ups, orbits that one gravitational center. Once you see the toll booth, you cannot unsee it. And once you see it, the last month of news suddenly makes sense. Here's what's happened in just the last few weeks, and it's why I'm making this video now and not in the autumn. First, at the end of June, the Joint Maritime Information Center, a body overseen by the U.S. Navy, announced a widened shipping route through the strait, running close to Oman, allowing more traffic in both directions. On the surface, that's a shipping notice. Read it as strategy, and it's a challenge. The United States was quietly redrawing the map of who decides the lanes, routing traffic through Omani waters to the south, away from the Iranian-controlled corridor in the north. That is not a neutral act. That is Washington saying, "We will define the road, not you." Second, Iran has been pushing its own vision. And this is the part almost nobody reported clearly. Tehran doesn't just want the strait reopened on American terms. It wants a new regime to govern the strait, its own governing framework. And one of its negotiators let slip in June that under Iran's vision, access to the strait would come with charges. There's your toll. Iran doesn't want to block Hormuz forever. Blocking is expensive. It wants to install a turnstile. It wants the world to pay Tehran for the privilege of moving oil through water Iran claims to govern. And third, watch the country in the middle. Oman has co-managed that strait with Iran for years, and Oman opposes any tolls. The United States has said tolls would be unacceptable in any deal. The Gulf states want free access. So you have Iran reaching for a turnstile and almost everyone else reaching for a crowbar to keep the gate open and unpriced. That is not a disagreement you paper over in 60 days. That is a disagreement about who owns a piece of the global economy. Now here's the tension. The thing that makes this genuinely dangerous rather than just tense. Every actor in this drama is negotiating with a gun still loosely in hand, and every actor has a clock that isn't the 60-day clock. The American president had a highly anticipated trip to Beijing on the calendar, and China, which depends on Hormuz oil more than almost anyone, has been openly calling for the strait to reopen. Arriving in Beijing with this unresolved weakens the American hand. So there's pressure to get a deal, any deal, fast. Iran, meanwhile, knows that its leverage is highest right now, while the fear premium is still baked into oil prices, while $5 gas is still a live threat. The moment the strait truly reopens and confidence returns, Iran's turnstile loses its power. So Iran's incentive is to go slow, to keep just enough perception of risk alive to keep its bargaining chip warm. And there's a third clock, running in a capital that isn't even in the region, Beijing. This is the piece I most want you to hold on to, because it's the one that turns a Middle East story into a global one. China is the largest single buyer of the oil that moves through Hormuz. A very large share of everything that leaves that strait heading east ends up feeding Chinese refineries and Chinese industry. Which means that when Iran squeezes the strait, it isn't only squeezing American drivers, it's squeezing its own most important patron. And China did not stay quiet. Beijing publicly called for the strait to be reopened. Think about what that means. Iran's single most powerful diplomatic backer, the country that reportedly helped nudge Tehran toward the very first ceasefire, was also quietly telling Iran that the closure was hurting China. So Iran is caught in a contradiction of its own making. The strait is its greatest weapon against the United States. It is also a knife pointed at the belly of its most valuable friend. Every day Iran keeps Hormuz twitchy to bleed Washington. It also bleeds Beijing, and a regime as isolated and sanctioned as Iran's cannot afford to lose China. That contradiction is a leash. It's part of why Iran keeps reaching for a turnstile and a toll, rather than a wall. A wall hurts everyone. A turnstile lets the oil flow to the friends and taxes the passage of the rest. Iran doesn't want Hormuz closed. It wants Hormuz owned. There is a world of difference between those two words, and the entire negotiation lives in the gap between them. Do you see the trap? One side is racing the clock. The other side profits from the delay. That is a recipe for a deal that gets signed and doesn't get implemented, which, if you look back at this entire conflict, is exactly what kept happening. Ceasefires announced from a golf course, celebrated on social media, and then quietly not honored on the water 3 days later. This war has produced more breakthroughs than any conflict I can remember, and most of them dissolved on contact with reality. And I want to give you the concrete example because it's the clearest window into why paper keeps failing here. Over and over through this conflict, the thing that broke the ceasefires wasn't Hormuz directly. It was Lebanon. The pattern went like this. Mediators would get the Americans and Iranians close to a deal. Then, sometimes within hours of an expected signing, Israel would strike Hezbollah targets in southern Lebanon, once even in Beirut. Iran, which treats Hezbollah as part of its own strategic depth, would call those strikes a violation of the agreement. And Iran's response, again and again, was to reach back to its one universal lever and pause traffic through Hormuz once more. Israel would say Lebanon was never part of the ceasefire. The Americans would back that reading. Iran would reject it. And the deal that looked done at breakfast was rubble by dinner. Sit with what that reveals. The strait is connected by an invisible wire to a conflict happening 2 countries away. You cannot isolate Hormuz. You cannot draw a clean box around it and negotiate it on its own, because Iran has deliberately wired it to everything, to Lebanon, to sanctions, to the nuclear file, to its own survival. That's not a bug in the negotiation. That's Iran's design. A choke point is most valuable when pulling it yanks on every other string at once. And it means the 60-day clock isn't really counting down to a deal on shipping lanes. It's counting down to a deal on the entire regional order, compressed into a window far too short to hold it. That's not a negotiation. That's a fuse. So let me do the thing this channel is actually for. Not prophecy. Scenarios. Here are the 3 ways I think this resolves, and roughly how likely each one is. And I want to be honest, this is a judgment call, not a certainty. And the whole point of laying out 3 is that I don't know which one we get. The most likely outcome, and I'd put it a little above even odds, is what I'd call managed ambiguity. No clean deal, no new war. The strait stays technically open but practically twitchy. Iran never gets its formal toll on paper, but it keeps a soft, de facto veto. A vetting process here, a safety inspection there, a periodic flare-up that reminds the underwriters to keep premiums high. Traffic recovers, but slowly, and never fully to where it was. Everyone declares victory. Nobody has won. This is the outcome that looks most like the messy present simply continuing. And in geopolitics, the present continuing is almost always the smart bet. The second scenario, less likely but far more dangerous, call it 1 in 3, is collapse at the deadline. The 60-day clock runs out with the hard questions unresolved because the hard questions were always unresolvable in 60 days. One side accuses the other of violating the terms, and given the track record, they'll both have material. Limited fighting resumes. Hormuz tightens again. Oil spikes. The difference this time is that the world has already paid for one crisis and has less patience and thinner buffers for a second. That's the scenario that keeps energy analysts awake. And the third, the one I'd love to be wrong about being pessimistic on, a genuine, durable, multilateral navigation regime. Something where Oman, the Gulf states, maybe European navies, and yes, even Iran, agree to a shared framework that keeps the strait open and untaxed, backed by enough guarantees that Iran gives up the turnstile in exchange for sanctions relief it actually needs. It's the cleanest ending. It's also the least likely, and I'd put it lowest of the 3, because it requires Iran to surrender its single best piece of leverage, and regimes almost never do that voluntarily while they still feel the knife at their own throat. Notice what all 3 scenarios share. In none of them does Iran simply lose control of the strait. In none of them does the choke point stop being a weapon. Because that is the permanent fact underneath all the temporary news, geography gave Iran a lever that no memorandum can take away. You can negotiate the terms of the lever. You cannot negotiate away the lever itself. It is carved into the map. Which brings me back finally to the water we started with. 21 miles wide, the thing you could see across on a clear day. I opened by telling you the paper they signed in June did not answer the question the war was about. Now you know why. The war was never about who could win a battle in the Persian Gulf. The answer to that was always the same, and everyone knew it. The war was about who gets to govern a choke point that the weaker party can close for almost nothing, and the stronger party can only reopen at enormous cost. And you cannot settle that with firepower, because firepower is the one tool that doesn't fit the lock. So they deferred it. They wrapped the unanswered question in 14 points and a 60-day clock and called it peace, because "we've paused the war and we'll argue about the real thing later" doesn't make a good headline. The war isn't over, it's on a timer, and the timer is running while you're watching this. Here's what I'd ask you to do. Don't watch the summits. Watch the shipping notices. Watch the insurance premiums. Watch whether merchant traffic through Hormuz is actually recovering week to week or just being announced as recovering. That data will tell you which of my 3 scenarios we're living in long before any government does. The truth in this story isn't in the press conference, it's in the water. If this is the way you like to see the world, the machinery under the headline, not the headline, subscribe and stay with me. Because I mentioned Beijing's stake in this strait, and there's a version of that story that goes much further than a single choke point. China has spent 2 decades building a way to move its oil that doesn't depend on any water a foreign navy can close. Pipelines, overland routes, a whole strategy for escaping exactly the kind of vulnerability we just watched paralyze the world. The question I want to sit with next time is the one this whole crisis raises and never answers. If the great powers are all quietly racing to escape the choke points, what happens to everyone who can't? Who gets left holding the strait? I'm Daniel Hahn. Watch the water.